All right, folks, hey, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Lance Spitzner from the SANS Institute, and super excited to have you join us. Now, this is going to be a fun, informal, and rather short, but to the point live stream about security culture, or more specifically, the top 5 most common myths and mistakes in the world of security culture. And I'm super excited about our guest, Dr. Jessica Barker, who will be joining us here in just a moment. Now, if you've never joined us for one of these live stream events before, and by the way, we are live streaming on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn. So folks, we have people from all over the world using all different types of technologies. And what we're going to be doing is, making this very interactive. So please post your comments, post your questions. We're going to be posting some cloud technology for you to play with. Some of it I don't even understand. And also, we're going to be sharing with you some updates on what's going on in the world today. And yes, this will be recorded. So if you want to share with anyone afterwards, or if you have to step out for any reason, the recordings will be posted and shared freely also. And I see folks posting messages. Fantastic. Like we said, we want to make this interactive. Now, before we jump right in, what I'd like to do is introduce both Michelle and Thomas. We're going to take a slight pause for a moment and get the latest News Bites update. If you're not familiar with News Bites, it's just another one of the many fantastic free resources from SANS. Twice a week, News Bites puts out an email free to anyone with all the latest events going on in cybersecurity, breaches, vulnerabilities, latest announcements, latest technologies, with commentary by many of SANS top instructors. So go ahead. I'm going to hand it over to both Michelle and Thomas for the latest in News Bites.
Hello, and welcome to Wait Just an Infosec News Bites. I'm contributing editor Thomas Wolf, here with contributing editor Michelle Peterson. And we've got another great show for you today, folks. What do we have going on today, Michelle?
Hey, Thomas. Well, first, we have an update to last week's Microsoft Cloud DDoS attack, and we have an update on the evolving Move It transfer vulnerabilities. And then in our last story, we'll talk about a new Windows security feature rollout.
A bunch of great stories today, folks. So with that, let's jump right in. Michelle, take it away.
All right. Following up on last week's story about Microsoft Web Portal DDoS attacks, Microsoft has now confirmed the outages were indeed Layer 7 DDoS attacks. Credit where it's due for Microsoft stepping in and publicly revealing the issue. According to Microsoft Root Cause Report, the attacks are likely utilizing multiple virtual private servers with rented cloud infrastructure, open proxies, and DDoS tools. The hacker group, Anonymous Sudan, has taken responsibility for the attacks. However, some cybersecurity researchers believe that this is a false flag in light of recent evidence pointing to a Russia-linked group. Microsoft said there was no evidence that customer data was compromised. And now, following up on a story we've covered on our last 2 shows, we're all probably familiar with Move It Transfer by now. In recent weeks, Move It Transfer has been part of an ongoing cyber attack that has affected both the public and private sectors. Since that time, more organizations have disclosed compromise of their networks due to the Move It Transfer flaw, including Louisiana and Oregon Departments of Motor Vehicles, the Department of Energy, the BBC, and British Airways, to name a few. At this point, if your organization uses Move It Transfer, it's probably a really good idea to just consider it compromised and begin mitigation steps. It's pretty safe to assume there will be more victims in the weeks to come. Now back to you, Thomas.
Thanks, Michelle. In some positive news, Microsoft's Windows 11 Win32 isolation security feature is now in public review. Microsoft has been making big moves in the last several months to harden the security of its products, a few of which we've covered in past shows. The isolation feature is built using app containers as one of its foundational pillars. The feature is currently limited to Win32 applications that have the isolation capability and use the virtualized registry and file system and run at low privilege levels. It's an environment where only trusted apps can run, but only in separate containers, making horizontal movement and payload execution much harder. Basically, it's a sandbox for 32-bit apps that limits harm caused by compromised applications by not allowing the containerized app to run at higher privilege levels. This new security update is in response to the rise in zero-day attacks, many of which target desktop applications. And those are your SANS News Bites for the week. For more critical cybersecurity news and commentary from some of the sharpest minds in InfoSec, don't forget to subscribe to the SANS News Bites newsletter, your twice-weekly summary and analysis of the most significant cybersecurity developments at sans.org/newsbites. Thanks again. I'm your host, Thomas Wolf.
And I'm your host, Michelle Peterson. We hope to see you again next time.
All right, Michelle, Thomas, thank you so much. And folks, once again, that's the News Bites. It's a free twice-a-week update on everything going on in the world of cybersecurity. We have other newsletters also, like the Ouch Security Awareness newsletter. And in fact, sometimes you get overwhelmed on all of the different free resources SANS puts out. I'm talking about not only webcasts, summits, posters, checklists, it's just amazing. One of my favorite URLs, and it's kind of a SANS hidden secret, is sans.org/free. It's everything out there that's community-based, that's free out there. So if you get lost and confused, sans.org/free is your go-to link. All right, folks, now what we're going to do here is just spend a couple of minutes on something fun where we ask you a question and you get a chance to post your answers. We're going to use something called Slido.com. And if you've never used it before, the easiest thing, grab your phone, go to Slido.com, or just our friend, the QR code up there. Yes, you can trust us. And when you go to Slido.com, enter the number you see right there. That's the unique identifier for this question. And then you can post the words that are associated with this. I see we've already got folks out there typing the words that they use that they feel are the best indicators of a strong security culture. Now, the reason we're asking you this question is this. Just about everyone I talk to out there agrees, yes, we all need a strong security culture. You see it discussed in frameworks like NIST, at conferences, at publications. I see this going on everywhere, but nobody really takes a moment I see to define, what is a security culture? What is a strong security culture? How would I know if I'm looking at a strong security culture? So this is one of the reasons we're asking you this question. And I'm already people-centered. Yes. Oh, I'm already loving some of the things right there. Safety and trust. Absolutely. One of the key things you're going to see from Dr. Jessica Barker, who once again, I'm super excited to have here, is we're going to be talking a lot about feelings and emotion, because the biggest part of culture is what people think and feel, because people's emotions drive people's behaviors. So engagement, absolutely. If your workforce is not engaged, how can we be secure? And I love how people are using safety and trust. Do they trust the security team? Do they trust the policies, rewards, recognition? Absolutely. What's fascinating is I've done a lot of work in how to measure culture. That's one of the myths we're going to be talking about. And how to measure culture is quite often how human resources measures employee engagement, because how engaged people are at work has many similarities as how well they're engaged in security. And I see a lot of people talking about behavior. Absolutely. One of the key, think about this. Why do we want a strong security culture? Because In a strong security culture, we're creating environments where people are more likely to behave securely. So ultimately, it's creating an environment where people behave more secure. But by focusing on the culture, you're creating an environment where it's far more likely to happen. Top executive buy-in, absolutely. Loving a lot of these. And so notice how transparency is important because this creates an environment of trust. You know, one of the things I'm going to see, and I'll check with the moderators of this, is if we can get a list of all these words and which are the most popular words and start sharing that with you. So security awareness, I would say security awareness is a driver that helps build that strong security culture. Lovable. I love it. Strong reporting. I love how somebody's brought up strong reporting. Security culture is not just about prevention. It's about detection and response. Here's one of my favorite indicators of a strong security culture. And this both builds on trust and reporting. Think about this one. How safe do your employees feel reporting an incident, even if they know they caused it? Think about it. We spend so much time teaching people about reporting, but how safe do they feel reporting? If you have a punitive security culture or a toxic or negative security culture, even though people are well trained on how to report, if they're afraid of the security team, if they're afraid of the punitive culture, nobody is going to report. Here's one more of my favorite indicators, and then we're going to turn it over to the real brains of this operation, Jessica. But here's one more. One of my favorite indicators of a strong security culture is not how often we're communicating to and engaging our workforce. That's a measurement of what we're doing. One of my favorite indicators is how often is your workforce reaching out to and engaging the security team? Are they asking the security team questions? Are they asking them to come brief of different team meetings? Are developers and IT admins getting the security team engaged in projects early on? So one of my favorite indicators of culture is not how often we're engaging and training the workforce, but how often is the workforce taking the initiative to engage the security team? If everybody's trying to avoid the security team, that could be an indicator of a punitive or negative security culture. Whereas if everybody's actively engaging the security team. All right, folks, so what we're going to do is this, is we've got a short video we want to show you, and then we're going to turn it over to Jessica. Well, Jessica and I, but she's the real brains. All right, quick video.
So my name is Mackenzie Morris, and currently I'm a senior industrial consultant for Dragos. And during my first job as a process controls engineer, I came to find that chemical engineering was not the career for me. I pivoted into system administration for Emerson Delta V, and like cybersecurity fell into my responsibilities. And my manager sort of just sent me to Sec West 2018, where I took Sec 401 with Brian Simon. I just like fell in love with cybersecurity like immediately, and I would like immediately started thinking like, how could I come back and take more? How could I do this the most efficient way? I always would tell people to take courses in person if you can, just because there's such a different experience sort of being like in the same place at the same time, because there's a lot of education that can take you can take on outside of the classroom. And if you go to one of these SANS courses and you're not taking the time to approach the instructor or your classmates, like you're missing out on a lot of the value, because there's so much to learn from just casual conversation with people, and there's so many stories to hear about people's experiences in in cybersecurity or in your industry, especially if you're at a subspecialty. There's just so much to learn from both your classmates and your instructors.
And folks, that's another great thing about SANS. We really promote the interaction and the community. By the way, did you notice Mackenzie mentioned he's from a company called Dragos? What does this have to do with security culture? 2 months ago, Dragos experienced an incident. They got hacked. It was one of their brand new employees. In fact, I'm going to ask the host to share the link where they do the write-up on the hack. What made Dragos, the company, so inspiring about how they responded to that incident is the CEO, Rob Lee, specifically called out on Twitter and posted, "Hey folks, we had an incident. One of our employees got phished. It was just a brand new employee getting hired. It was actually their personal account where the cyber attackers then used that to get into the organization." And what was so fascinating from a culture perspective is the CEO posted on Twitter, "Hey, we had an incident. We're going to be very transparent. We're going to share everything about it. And we do not blame the individual who got hacked. In fact, this new hire is going to be a very important part of our organization." He literally posted on Twitter, "We got hacked. We know who in our organization was the reason. We don't blame them. We're not going to hold them victim." And he posted that on Twitter. That is amazing. What a fantastic way to build trust. What a fantastic way to ensure people feel safe reporting an incident. When the CEO goes, "We had an incident," the employee is not going to be held responsible. They did everything right. So long story short, just another great example of culture, another good indicator. All right, folks, now we're here to talk about the 5 myths, and I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Jessica Barker. If you don't know her, she is a fantastic wealth of knowledge, spending years on the human side of cybersecurity. And what's amazing is Jessica has spent most of her life in the UK. She's just recently moved to Las Vegas. Talk about change of culture. And so we now have a fantastic resource in the UK. Now, before we jump in, Jessica, could you just spend a moment sharing your background and your involvement in culture?
Sure. Hi, thanks, Lance, and hi, everyone. Real pleasure to be joining you all today. So I fell into cybersecurity about 13 years ago. I was approached, headhunted for a job in cybersecurity by a team that felt they had all the technical specialism that they needed. They wanted somebody to look at cybersecurity in organizations from the human side. So once I had Googled what is cybersecurity and learned a bit more about it, I just as you heard in the video from Mackenzie, I fell in love with the topic, and it took me a while, but after a year or so, really started to understand why my background in sociology, politics, and civic design really did lend itself to the human side of cybersecurity. So for the last 13 years, I've been working with organizations around the world on their awareness, behavior, and culture programs, written a couple of books, love to speak about cybersecurity, particularly when we're talking about culture. So delighted to be joining you all for this conversation today.
All right, now, before we jump in, we're going to be jumping in on the top 5 myths. So I would love, Jessica, your definition of security culture and why it's important. And before you start, folks, please remember, everybody has a slightly different definition of security culture and different reasons why. So whenever you're discussing security culture with someone, never feel bad going, "Hey, what's your definition of security culture?" So Jessica, what is your definition and why is it important?
Firstly, Lance, that is such a good point. We've been increasingly talking about security culture for the last few years, but it's so true that we can all have slightly different definitions. So it's great to get on the same page with this. For me, cybersecurity culture comes down to 4 key areas. So we are looking at awareness and behavior, but we're also looking at values and perceptions. So what is seen as normal and accepted in the organization? And therefore, how does that translate into how people behave on a day-to-day basis? So we're looking at factors like, what do people think of the security team and their role? What do people think of the senior executives? Are they not just championing security in their words, but also in their behaviors? How do people feel about themselves? all the research out there shows that perceptions of self-efficacy, so the extent to which people think they can engage in cybersecurity, that is going to be the biggest factor in actually promoting behavior change, way more than, whether people are aware of the threats. So this really comes down to how people feel about security, not just on an individual basis, but also what is woven into the organization.
All right, fantastic. And folks, what's really interesting is if you go in research culture, you're going to find many, many different definitions, not just security culture. And one more thing before we jump in. This concept of organizational culture is not new. There are decades and decades of research out there. Thaler and Sunstein, Daniel Kahneman, Simon Sinek, John Kotter, the ADKAR model, John Kotter's 8 steps. There's decades and decades of research out there. So don't think we have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to security culture, because it's just another type of culture. There's safety culture, wellness culture. So we highly recommend, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Leverage all of the great research, all the great studies in science that's already out there. Speaking of which, what I'd like to do is start with our with our 5 myths. And what I'm going to do is, Jessica and I got together, had a bunch of different ones, and created our 5. And so, Jessica, what I'm going to do is actually start with number 5. Because number 5 was one that you called out and I really, really like. So number 5 is this. Okay, you folks can read. We simply bolt security on top of our organizational culture. So first of all, Jessica, what do you mean by this? And why do you feel this is a myth or a mistake?
So I see this all the time, this perception that we can just add security culture on. It's like an add-on, rather than thinking about it as something that is woven into the existing organizational culture. And there's a couple of issues here, but one that I see really commonly is when you have a security team that is trying to push and build an approach to security, therefore the security culture, which is at odds with the wider organizational culture. So if you have a very positive organization that's very people focused, but the security team is putting controls in place without explaining them, is pushing out changes and policy without consulting the business, if the communications don't explain the why, and if people feel punished or they fear punishment for reporting an incident or an issue, then what you have is a security culture that's very at odds with the organizational culture, and it's the security culture that will suffer. I often hear people saying we need to build a security culture. Well, the truth is you already have a security culture, whether you've been actively building it or not, whether it's positive or negative, you have a culture around cybersecurity. You might just not know what it is, and it might be one that has built up without your conscious thought or effort. So firstly, understanding your organizational culture, then understanding your security culture, and then building a program to actively work on that culture if it isn't moving in the direction that you want. That's really what I mean by number 5, is your security culture needs to move with the current and the tide of your existing organizational culture, with those values, which will supercharge it.
So it sounds like the word we're looking for is you don't want to bolt security on, you want to align and embed security into the existing culture.
Yes, exactly. And when I work with organizations, people sometimes, if they haven't had this mindset, they'll think, well, how do we work with our organizational culture and values? Well, often there has been work done to look at the values, the mission, the strategy of the organization. So it's about looking at those through the lens of security. If your organization is very customer focused, then of course security and security culture is extremely relevant to that. You can help tap into that value by talking about what your security program does to support the customers. You can maybe think about, how much guidance do we provide to our customers? How much do we speak to them about security? And how much do we make our colleagues aware that when they're practicing positive security behaviors, they're engaging in that wider mission and value to be customer focused.
So I really love what Jessica's bringing up here for a couple of reasons. First of all, what sounds like Jessica is saying is before you start running out and going, hey, we want to build a strong security culture, first understand your overall organizational culture. Is your overall organizational culture very outgoing, like perhaps a tech startup, or is it very conservative, like a utility company? How your organization operates and thinks your security team has to align with. But also comes back once again to this idea that people have emotion. They, their thoughts, their feelings, and you have to ensure whatever those values, thoughts, and feelings are align with the overall organizational culture. Now, what's really interesting, I see we have a post from Stephen Middleton. Stephen posts, first of all, Jessica, he's from Warrington, England. I have no idea where that is.
I used to work in Warrington. Hello,
What's
Warrington.
That?
I used to work in Warrington. Hello, Warrington.
Well, that always amazes me. Everybody from the UK knows like where every single town is in the country. And half the time they can just pick up what town they're from based on their accent. But anyway, Stephen brings up a real good point that aligns with number 5. And he says, we are on the culture journey. And there we go right there. In trying to incorporate cyber by focusing on how people can stay safe at home. Stephen, fantastic one. Now, first, this approach may not work for every organization. It depends on your culture. But if you have a culture where your organization is employee focused, family focused, things like that, this could be a fantastic way to not only help secure people. You're right. They're not only exhibiting secure behaviors at home, but at work. But now the security team and security is perceived as collaborative, helpful, supportive. Wow, the security team not only helped me secure at work, but secure at home. So we're starting to build a positive security culture. But like I said, this may not work with every organization. It depends on your organizational culture.
Yeah, I agree, Lance. I think the other powerful thing about this, and you touched on it, is that it's really starting to flip some of the perceptions that we've historically had about security teams. If your security team has been historically seen as the department of no and as negative, then focusing on security in people's personal lives, as you say, it helps to build up those positive perceptions where people think, hey, security is actually helping me and my family and things that I care about.
All right, fantastic. So we've got 4 more to go here. Start with number 4. So I believe once again, this is yours, and this is a favorite one of mine too. Working on security culture is pointless. It will never stop all breaches. So focus on tech instead. I mean, the one I always hear is, oh, it only takes 1 click.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we need a like security culture bingo, and this is one that I have heard multiple times. People say to me, well, having a good security culture, having an awareness program in place, what's the point, because it's not going to stop everything. So let's just focus on the tech, because of course the technology is 100%, right? I mean, we don't take that approach with technology. We understand this needs to be a layered approach. We're not talking about either or. In fact, having a stronger security culture helps us have stronger technical defenses too, because it will actually help the security team. We must remember that when we talk about security culture, this isn't everybody outside of the security team. This is the security team as well. And as Lance said at the start, when you have a positive, proactive security culture, then people will come to the security team more readily. So that includes your developers, for example. Therefore, it actually does lead to a stronger technical approach as well, more secure coding, for example. So with this one, I just think it comes down to a lack of understanding of the human side, and maybe people feeling if they don't fully understand it, if they're more technology orientated, then they're just going to push aside the idea of culture. And as you said, Lance, that old classic, it just takes one click to ruin a network. Well, in that case, you've got some big technical issues that you need to address, and trying to blame that on one person is really unfair and indicative of a negative security culture. Oh, I can't hear you, Lance. Is it just me?
Oh, there we go. Now, on the whole idea, Jessica just pointed out this idea, just one person clicked. The idea being, Dragos pointed out on Twitter, no, we're not going to hold that one person to blame. That one person, you know what? They hadn't even joined our company yet. As opposed to Equifax, when it got hacked in 2017, what did the Equifax CEO do in Congress? Specifically blamed one person and then lost his job because they actually had real bad security culture. So 2 points to follow up to what Jessica said here. And the first one, and some of you might have missed it, she brought up a really good point. Remember, we said earlier, by having a strong security culture, you create an environment where people are more likely to behave securely. That's not just individuals talking about phishing and passwords. When you have a strong security culture, that means the developers believe in cybersecurity and trust the security team. That means your DevSecOps program is far more likely to succeed when you train your developers and implement a program to securely or create secure code. Why do so many DevSecOps programs fail? Because there's a toxic relationship between the security team and the developers. Strong security culture, developers are engaged, they buy in, more likely to create secure code. But this is true for almost any security initiative. So it's not just the individuals, but those initiatives. Think vulnerability management. Oh, and I love Andrew's. Yes, force multiplier. And Andrew, I'm stealing that one. Think about vulnerability management. This is one of the fundamental controls for managing risk. I think it's like control number 3 in the critical controls, CIS critical controls. Vulnerability management. Every organization out there is doing something about it. But quite often we fail. Why do we fail? Not because of the technology involved, but quite often, once again, there's a bad or toxic relationship between the security teams and the IT admins. The security teams identify the vulnerabilities, the IT admins patch the vulnerabilities. Sounds relatively simple, it's not. But quite often the failure is not because of the technology involved, but because of the processes, communications, the trust, the relationship between security and the IT admins. So many of your security initiatives, like DevSecOps, vulnerability management, some incident response, detection, all of these initiatives are far more likely to succeed with that strong security culture. I love the amplifier. But the other thing, just to Jessica's point, we're attempting to reduce risk. We can't eliminate it. Does antivirus capture all malware? No. Do we still use it? Yes. Firewalls stop all attacks? Of course not. Do we still use it? Yes. So this is nothing more than another control to help reduce risk. But I will point out also, what happens if somebody clicks and then goes, ooh, I shouldn't have clicked. That looks odd, and then reports it? Far too often we focus just on the prevention. What about the detection and response? By improving and building that human sensor network, you have much stronger resilience. Think about it. What is detection? Looking for bad or unusual behavior. Who knows normal? Your IT admins, your developers. So there's some of the best people to identify abnormal bad activity. All right, so number 4, why focus on culture? It'll never stop all breaches. Nothing will stop all breaches. But not only will this dramatically reduce the likelihood, probability, but if we improve our detection capabilities, and reduce dwell time, we reduce impact. All right, so let's go with number 3. Now, number 3, I got to pick out here. And this is one I really wanted to focus on. Security culture is too touchy-feely. There's no way to quantify it. There's no way to action on it. Nope, not the case. How can you quantify culture? How can you quantify what people think or feel? There are entire PhDs that study this. It's called social science. If you have in fact, I forget. Jessica, what's your PhD in?
So my PhD was in civic design, where I was really looking at the growth of the internet economy and the impact that had on society. So one thing I was doing for my PhD, and part of the reason I got hired for my first cybersecurity job, was I was holding loads of interviews. So I was interviewing all sorts of different people in different roles, different levels of organizations, to find out, how they felt about the topic that I was researching. And that is what I still often do in cybersecurity. As you say, when we're trying to find out how people feel about something, what we need to do is actively listen to them, ask the right questions, listen to the answers. And as Lance said earlier on in this discussion, there is decades of research in organizational culture that we can draw on. People have been understanding, analyzing, measuring, and improving, taking action on organizational culture for decades. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We can apply a lot of that to security culture.
One of my favorite resources for organizational culture is actually HBR.org, Harvard Business Review. There are master programs in organizational culture because businesses realize having a strong organizational culture helps drive profits, efficiencies, things like that. So what ends up happening is this. How do you quantify security culture? Take a step back. How do you quantify culture? Like Jessica said, you ask, but you have to do it in a scientific way. So what we do is, why reinvent the wheel? Let's go to the world of organizational culture, human resources, and study something called engagement surveys. Engagement surveys are a scientifically proven way to quantify your culture, by just like Jessica said. You ask questions. The trick is, what questions do we want to ask? Because you can't just go and ask your workforce, hey, what do you think about cybersecurity? That's very nebulous, very vague. And how do you quantify it? So first, how do you quantify? Something called the Likert scale, developed by Rensis Likert, and is what you've done this before. On a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable are you reporting an incident to the security team? On a scale of 1 to 5, how highly targeted do you feel? So the Likert scale is how you measure what people think. If you've ever taken a SANS course, you've taken those evaluations. On a scale of 1 to 5, what did you think about the content? So there's an entire science behind the Likert scale. Then the question becomes, well, what questions do we ask? And this is the real power of measuring security culture. This is where we have to apply it to our world. Like Jessica mentioned, what is security culture? Well, what people think and feel about cybersecurity. That's really vague. How do we measure it? Aha! What are the biggest drivers of what people think and feel about cybersecurity? What they think and feel about the security team, security policies, and security training. If they trust the security team, you're building a strong culture. If they find your policies easy to follow, building a strong security culture. If they find your security training engaging and relevant and applicable, you're building a strong culture. So if I want to quantify culture, I don't ask, hey, what do you feel about the cybersecurity? Too vague, open-ended. I use the Likert scale of 1 to 5. I can now quantify, and then I ask questions about what people think about the security team. On a scale of 1 to 5, how likely are you to approach the security team with a question about technology? On a scale of 1 to 5, how easy is it to follow our processes? On a scale of 1 to 5, how engaging and relevant is our security training? So by asking these questions about the biggest drivers of your culture, you can then start quantifying not only what your culture is, but where you're weak. Here's an example. You ask people, How easy is it to report an incident? Oh, very, very easy, because you've trained me so much. So we've done a good job on training. How likely are you to report an incident if you know you caused it? Well, even though I know how to report an incident, I'm very unlikely to report it because I don't trust the security team. Aha! We're doing a good job of training, but there's not a lot of trust with the security team. Now we can start doing focus groups and interviews. Why don't they trust the security team? So overall, can you quantify culture? Absolutely. Organizations have been doing it for decades. All we need to do is translate it to the security world, focusing on things like the people's perceptions of the team, policies, training. So I don't know, Jessica, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think so many great points, Lance, and I'm seeing some really interesting comments coming through from people joining us. So one thing says is, making the survey anonymous to get the most honest answers. And I think that's a really good point. One thing that I do when I'm exploring security culture is hold focus groups for organizations. And so then the big thing that I'm focusing on, particularly to start with, is communicating this is all anonymous. This is all a trusted space. There's nobody from the security team here. It's just us talking about security and really building up that rapport. And one thing people often say to me at the end of a focus group is they'll kind of sigh and they'll say, that felt kind of like therapy. People want to talk about cybersecurity. Security is touching their lives, both at work and at home, on a really regular basis. They're seeing all these breaches in the news almost as much as we are, probably not following it quite to the same degree, but they're seeing all these headlines and they're having to deal with security on a day-to-day basis. So people often want their voice to be heard. They want that opportunity to share and then to know that they can contribute to better security. Often if people are practicing workarounds, it's about finding out why. So, somebody said, how do you get people to take the survey? Well, I'd be interested if Lance has a different answer, but for me, if we're rolling out a survey and people aren't engaging in it, I really want to understand why. Because that in itself, the fact that people aren't engaging is indicative of culture. It might be that they're too busy. It might be that they're overwhelmed. So that's a wider organizational culture issue, but that has an impact on security because we know the busier people are, the more overwhelmed they are, the more likely they are to click links in phishing emails, for example. But it might also be that people don't trust the security team even enough to fill out a survey, in which case that also gives you a starting point. So there's lots of indicators you can find here. You can find indicators of security culture in the data. Are people reporting phishing? How quickly are they reporting them? Are they reporting some, if you're doing phishing simulations, are they reporting some more than others? Are different departments reporting some more than others? What are people's behaviors like around passwords? There's lots of indicators of security culture that you can look at. As Lance said, it's about asking the right questions, looking for the right data, and then really understanding how you're analyzing it.
All right, I'm going to just bring up one more point in what Jessica said, and then we got two more questions. But there was a great question. How do we get people to answer these questions anonymously? They may be, or honestly. How do we get them to answer honestly? Well, once again, we go to the science of social science, survey design, multiple ways to do it. Make it anonymous, ask the same question in multiple ways. But here's one fantastic way. You don't have to ask people, hey, what do you think of the security team? Have you ever shared your password? Why me? No, I would never share my password. There's ways to articulate the question to get more honest answers. On a scale of 1 to 5, how likely is it one of your coworkers would share their password? Oh, me? No, I would never share my password. But my coworkers? Oh, hell yeah, in a heartbeat. Well, then you start getting those numbers, and then over the years, are those numbers improving? Are people less likely to share their passwords? So you can formulate questions where people are more likely to give honest answers. How likely would your coworkers follow this policy? All right, so let's go to number 2 here. Number 2 is a rather simple one, and I added this here because I really wanted to emphasize a point. Hey, you know what? We totally get it. Security culture is important. We'll go over to Bob. He is in charge of the firewalls. Bob, in charge of, in addition to everything else, you're in charge of our security culture. Go. Why is this so bad, Jessica?
Well, for one thing, Bob's going to be pretty overworked. And we know that security professionals in general, security teams at the minute, they are stretched, they're overworked, under-resourced. Club CISO survey, I'm on the advisory board of Club CISO. Our survey results came out a week or so ago and found one of the biggest blockers to security culture, one of the biggest issues that security leaders are dealing with is an overstretched and under-resourced team. I don't think that'll be news to anybody here. So you are stretching your team too thinly. That can cause burnout, that can have issues on a personal and of course organizational level when it comes to your security. So that's one issue with this, but also security culture, the social sciences, as Lance said, this is a unique skill set. This takes knowledge and experience. So asking somebody who has no experience in this to suddenly get up to speed, unfortunately, they might just not have the skills, the capacity, the experience, the knowledge to be able to fulfill that role. And what may then happen is they may pursue strategies that not only don't improve your security culture, it could make it worse. So for example, if they think, well, what we need to do is scare people into better security practices, which I hear very commonly from people, we just need to scare them, we just need to shock them, and then they'll behave more securely. Say that's what they decide to do. Well, we know from decades of research that a fear-based approach, that going heavy on the threats, that not only doesn't help, but it often makes things worse. It's more likely that people will hide incidents, that they won't report issues, that they won't engage with the security team. So there you actually have put things back, and rebuilding trust is harder than starting from a more blank canvas.
And to follow on Jessica's point, so quite often the security teams do things wrong, and the whole idea of trust and fear and thinking phishing simulations. Sometimes security teams, push it too far. Hey, everyone, you got a bonus. Gotcha. So what ends up happening is there's another thing too. Quite often security teams or individuals like Bob want to do the right thing, but there's an element called curse of knowledge, cognitive bias. The more of an expert you are at something, the worse you are at communicating it. If Bob is highly technical, security is easy for Bob. Bob assumes it's simple for everyone else. And then Bob starts sending out really confusing communications that nobody understands, thinking everybody understands it. Hey, folks, some of the latest APT threat actors have changed TTPs, and they're really coming at us in a more of a BEC method. So as a result of that, we're going to roll out MFA with an ETA of this Friday. Go to it. And to Bob, all of that made sense. And the rest of the organization is going, was that English? So quite often, I see this now. A lot of security teams are trying to engage, but we lack the skills and training to engage. And quite often, it's simply because the more technical we are, the more we can struggle with that bias. All right, folks, we're wrapping up today. We're going to come down to number one. Number one, and this is a really common misconception. Well, you know what? I'll just run a security awareness program for 6 months, and then boom, we're done. Security awareness is just one element of culture. Think about it. Your culture is driven by what people think about the security team, policies, training, and just about everything. In other words, and this alludes to what Jessica started with, you're building your security culture every single day. Every time an employee interacts with security, every time your workforce pushes out an email, training, policy, a new tool, every time there's that interaction, you're building your culture. The question then becomes, how do we make that culture a positive experience where they trust and enable? Or is that going to be a negative experience, punitive, arrogant, egotistical, overwhelming? So Jessica, I'll give you 1 or 2 minutes and then we're going to have to wrap things up.
Yeah, just to echo that, Lance. You know, this idea that we can just run an awareness program. Well, security culture is about a lot more than awareness. It's also about behavior, perceptions, and values. And the idea that security culture can be done, we've ticked that box. We've worked on it for a few months. Well, culture is a living thing, and this is all a process. We're not looking for an end state with this. Awareness, behavior, and culture will never be done, because as soon as we have reached one point, it will be moving on. It's always evolving. So this is something that we need to work on a day-to-day basis. We need to look at those interactions, and we need to understand that culture is something that is ingrained in the organization. And so we will be working on that as the security program moves on. We know that security programs are always evolving, and so does your security culture program need to do the same.
So the whole idea here, folks, is culture is something you're always building. And that's why, once again, I like to break it down: security team, policies, and training. You have a great security awareness program, fantastic. But what do people think about policies and the team? So anytime the security team interacts with the workforce, like sending out an email, how can we make that approachable, collaborative, easy to follow? Policies, how can we simplify them? How can we provide tools to make it simpler? How can we communicate them in a way that's approachable and collaborative? So the whole idea is culture is not about a single initiative. Your security culture is driven by every interaction. If your security team is having a lot of negative interactions with your developers, you're just continually building a bad culture. How do we take a step back? And how can we collaborate and enable and help the developers or the IT admins or things like that? All right, folks, lots of fantastic comments. I was hoping we could go on a couple more, but we are going to have to wrap things up. Jessica, anything else you'd like to share before we end?
If people want to read more about what I think of security culture, those 4 areas that I spoke about, we recently published a guide at Sygenta, so do check out our ultimate guide to security culture. And if you need to find that, find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever it may be. I'll be sharing a link of that later, and I hope you'll find it helpful. But really, I guess I just want to highlight one of the most recent comments we just had. We've had some great interaction today from everybody joining us, and somebody said security culture is a journey, not a destination. And I thought that was a fantastic quote for me to end things on.
And I noticed Pooja out there, thank you, talking about security ambassadors, security champions. There's an entire book. And remember, we're not reinventing the wheel. John Cotter published a book in 2018 called Accelerators, which is all about ambassadors, who are one of the best ways to drive change. So folks, once again, lots of great research out there. All right, now, as I mentioned, we're always putting out free resources to help you. I want to cover 2 more resources to help you on the security culture side, above what Jessica's already shared. First, the Human Risk Summit. This 24-25 August in, where are we going to, Vegas. This year we're in Vegas. So 24-25 August in Las Vegas, we are bringing together speakers from all over the world to talk precisely about this topic, the human side of cybersecurity. 2-day event, 2 tracks, multiple speakers. And what's fantastic, you can join us in person in Vegas or join us remotely, virtually, for free from anywhere in the world. Now, if you're going to join us in person, we have some additional benefits like workshops, networking events. We've got some special meetings, things like that. But if you join us virtually, you can take advantage of all of those talks. The other thing that we're going to be sharing to help you build that strong security culture is next month we're releasing the annual SANS Security Awareness Report. And this report takes data from thousands of awareness and culture professionals from all over the world and identifies who has the strongest programs and why. What are the lessons learned? What are the action items? What are the strongest programs doing? And then how can we apply those lessons learned at a global level? So half of the report is all about how to mature your program. key data-driven action items. But the other half of the report is all about you, how to grow your career, what skills, lessons learned, job titles, and compensation. What's the average security culture officer make? In what countries are they making the most? How can I increase my compensation? How can I increase my resources, leadership support? How can I grow my career? All of these things are in the report. So the report is not just about growing your program, but growing you. So 2 fantastic resources. The summit, this will be our 10th summit, Las Vegas, 24-25 August. You can attend in person or virtually. We have the report coming out next month. And once again, that is another free resource. All right, folks, I believe that means we're going to be wrapping things up. What I want to do now is, first of all, we will be having another event next, 11 July. And then Michelle, Thomas, anything else I need to cover before we wrap things up? All right, it looks like we are all good, folks. So once again, this is recorded. We're going to be sharing the recording. You've got the summit. You've got the resources Jessica shared. You've got the report. And if nothing else, reach out to Jessica. She is incredibly friendly and interactive. She is more than happy to answer questions. I, too, am happy to answer questions. Otherwise, folks, thank you so much for joining us. We will catch you in cyberspace. See you later.